Right, well, we've got to 5 o'clock, so I think we can make a start. Welcome, everybody. My name is Bill Gibson. I'm Director of the Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History at Oxford Brookes University, and we're here to celebrate the publication of this book, which I'm delighted to say has arrived in hard copy. So congratulations to Martin, Jane, and the contributors. My role really in this is to be the MC rather than anything else. So I'm going to be introducing the speakers. Essentially, our programme today is going to open with a brief word from Martin, and then talks, 5-minute talks from a number of the contributors, and then perhaps a little bit longer assessment from Andrew Chandler, and wrapping up with an editor's perspective on the project. So with no further ado, I should just say, if you can keep your microphones on mute throughout, that would be very helpful. But as I said a minute ago, if you wish to ask any questions, by all means, put them into the chat. And if we can get to them, I'll certainly arrange to do that. If there's time at the end, I'll invite people to have any questions. So do be thinking about questions if you have any. So to begin then, let me introduce Martin Wellings, one of the editors of the volume. And Martin, you're going to introduce today's event.
Thank you, Bill. Part of the purpose of the introduction is to express our huge gratitude to you for hosting this launch and for being really one of the key initiators of the project, which we're celebrating today. It's a great delight to be in such very distinguished company with a lot of people with huge academic and ecumenical expertise and experience. And we are looking forward to reflecting on some of the contents of a very rich volume of diverse essays exploring the relationship between the Methodist Church and the Church of England over a long period. A great relief, the book has actually now appeared in hard copy, and a number of people have got copies, which is fantastic. And I think probably that's as much as I need to say by way of introduction, because we're here to listen to the contributors and to have some snapshots of the material that they have written about in the volume.
Okay, great. Lovely. In which case, let's move on and hear from the contributors. And in running order from the programme, let's start with Pippa Catterall. So Pippa, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill. Well, I suppose I had some role in the start of this project, because back in the 1990s, I got some funding from Nuffield Trust to do a oral history of the Anglican-Methodist conversations, and then got given other jobs to do, never found any time to write it, and eventually simply deposited the material with Bill, who was very glad to take it. Time passed. Jane edited the material and catalogued it and so on, and all of a sudden it became possible to use this rich resource. And so here we are now with a book which draws on that and draws on other material from other sources as well. And I'm delighted to have been part of this, and finally got round to writing up that research that I did all those years ago. I just have a few observations about my chapter, which is entitled Church, Episcopacy and Ecumenism. And in those remarks, I'm going to try and give some thoughts to the challenges of the ecumenical task in the 20th century. We might think that it's difficult to speak of God, but we as churches make it difficult to speak of church order as well. And this issue is repeatedly the main stumbling block to church unity. In this country, until the 19th century, the role of the state was also a major factor in any considerations of church unity. As Henry Woodhouse, Methodist lawyer, sometime advisor towards Anglican-Methodist unity, pointed out, also worked in the Treasury Solicitor's Office, pointed out that under UK law, there was only one church, the Church of England. This was, as far as the state was concerned, the sacred counterpart of the secular states. Other churches, as far as the state was concerned, were simply voluntary bodies. This meant that any process of ecumenicalism was necessarily complicated by the ties of the Church of England to the state, by the inheritance it had in terms of attitudes to communion and sharing communion with other groups, and so on. So when you get into the late 19th, early 20th century, the framework through which the Church of England approached these things, as the state's dead hand gradually came off, was necessarily important. And the framework the Church of England went for was one they derived from America, from a man called W.R. Huntington, who was a priest in the Protestant Episcopalian Church, the Anglican equivalent over there, who in the aftermath of the US Civil War came up with something which by 1888 had become the Lambeth Quadrilateral. That ecumenism has to be based upon scripture, creeds, baptism and communion, and acceptance of the historic episcopacy. Well, the first two of those were relatively easy to resolve. Communion wasn't, and episcopacy certainly wasn't. When it came to talks with Methodism, to cut a long story short, as I take you in the chapter through the various ecumenical highways and byways of the 20th century, there were three, when it came to Methodism, there were three potential problems. One was not necessarily, three was potentially problematic, and four was even more so. This was not necessarily because of episcopacy per se. Methodists came to the conclusion that episcopacy was not necessarily of the esse, the being of the church, but it was of the bene esse, the well-being of the church. But Methodists attached very different meanings to episcopacy, and indeed these different meanings not only operated at the church level of the institution, but also within the churches. So you see a lot of infighting between Anglican evangelicals and Anglo-Catholics over the meaning of these things, not least because it has knock-on effects in terms of understandings of church order and indeed of ordination. A central issue was whether episcopacy in the apostolic succession was functional or fundamental. I have an abiding interest in the politics of ambiguity, and part of what drew me to this particular subject was the attempted ambiguities that Eric Kemp in particular used to bridge these various understandings in the service of reconciliation he drew up in the course of these negotiations, the appropriately called conversations, because it's then made it sound rather more discursive and less like they were actually heading towards a definite conclusion. Kemp tried in that service of reconciliation to come up with a solution which would enable all people to interpret it in the way they wished. In practice, he failed to do this. Indeed, when it came to the final round of negotiations up to 1972, the divisions in both churches were, if anything, greater than they had been. I would conclude with a few remarks. George Bell, the great Bishop of Chichester, was the first chair of the conversations. Bell had a very important role in the Church of England throughout the 20th century. He was an authority figure. He also had a more Iranic approach to the conversations than his successor, H.J. Carpenter. So one speculation is that if Bell hadn't died, perhaps they would have, in 1958, at an early stage in the conversations, perhaps they would have got on better. As it was, by the early 1960s, the Methodist evangelical Amos Creswell was lamenting, "The Anglican Methodists keep a watch over each other's sheep. They forget to give oats to the poor pagan goats who die while the church goes to sleep." And this, I think, is a kind of appropriate way to reflect on how everything, in the end, went wrong. More focus on the desideratum of the emerging united church might have provided the process with more momentum. The God-willed ideal of unity instead succumbed to wrangles about definition of church and ministry, which Kemp's ambiguities were never large enough to accommodate. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Pippa. That kicks things off very neatly, and I suspect leads in very naturally in some ways to Mark Chapman's comments, because it impinges in some ways on his chapter. So, Mark, over to you.
Thanks very much, Bill, and thanks, Pippa. It certainly, yes, it provides a good sort of complement, really, to the material I was drawing on in my chapter, which I suppose it was, how did Anglicanism become an episcopal denomination where Episcopalianism was of the essence of Anglicanism? And that's something I trace particularly in relation to some of the ecumenical discussions in relation to the Church of South India. And I trace through the chapter, I look in particular at the sort of the development of the understanding of Anglicanism focused on the historic episcopates and how that sort of found its way in Lambeth 1988 that we've already heard about, but also and particularly after the First World War and the sort of rebuilding of international relations in the Lambeth Appeal of 1920, which in many ways was always seen as a great proto-ecumenical document. Anglicans inviting other Protestant Christians to join in this kind of alternative Catholic Church. But it's also a sense in where the Episcopal order becomes the be-all and end-all of what that means. You don't have to take anything English into your system or anything like that at an international level, but you need to embrace the episcopate. And that obviously is something that's quite off-putting to a number of different denominations at an ecumenical level. And how this then begins to sort of take root in the discussions around the creation of the Church of South India. And what I've traced is the effect of the discussions in India on the Church of England and the kind of visceral reaction, particularly among Anglo-Catholics, to those that church, in particular the kind of interim period before all the bishops in the Church of South India would be part of the historic succession. And it was that sort of bearable anomaly that has been the principle for Anglican-Methodist discussions, including the most recent series, that's continues to provide a stumbling block between particularly Anglo-Catholics, but even more broadly, the kind of liberal Catholics in the contemporary Church of England and ecumenical rapprochement with the Methodists. And I try and show in the chapter that there could have been a different way for Anglicans, that there might have been a different vision of Anglicanism where episcopacy might have been seen to be the bene esse. It's better to have it than not to have it, but it wasn't absolutely necessary for a church to be a church. And I traced that through some of the writing at the end of the 19th century by Bishop Lightfoot and others, but also how that took root in the missionary situation in India and the work as well of the CMS as an alternative vision of what Anglicanism could have been. C.C. Venn in particular, the General Secretary, or the Secretary of the CMS at the end of the 19th century, very much tried to propagate the idea of a variety of types of episcopacy depending on the sort of the local development of the church in different parts of India, and to have a kind of commingled succession, as I suppose is what one might say, of different varieties of episcopacy, each relative to their own particular areas, but working together for the sake of the Church Catholic, and that could have been a principle for reunion in the domestic context as well, in the British Isles as well. So It could have been different, but I think it was the particular circumstances after the First World War, and particularly the dominance of Anglo-Catholicism in that period, that really meant that that alternative vision for Anglicans would never take root, or at least wouldn't ever become the kind of dominant strand of Anglicanism. And just finally, just in my own context, I've been involved in the last few years with the Meissen theological conversations with the German Protestant churches in the EKD. And it's exactly the same kind of issues that emerge there about full visible unity and what that might mean. And episcopacy remains that great stumbling block. We've had discussion after discussion about how this might work in practice and whether there can be a way of overcoming that fundamental division between the two denominations, the Church of England and the EKD, and we go round in circles over and over again. This is the problem that keeps re-emerging, and I think it's keeping re-emerging as the churches continue to decline, and becomes ever more urgent that we find new ways of addressing those kinds of issues. So I hope this book, which I have indeed received my copy of the book, I hope this book provides some kind of resource for overcoming some of those stumbling blocks into the future. Thank you.
Great, Mark, thank you very much indeed. That's a very interesting insight into not just Anglican-Methodist links, but introducing a German dimension is very, very interesting indeed. Now we move from true matters of ecumenism to a rather more interior discussion with Claire, whose article in the collection is based on the voice of Methodism. So Claire, over to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, hi, I'm Claire, and lovely to see lots of you again. I'm going to give a brief overview of my chapter on the Voice of Methodism Association, or VMA, throughout the years 1963 to 72. And I think in some they show how throughout this period in the Methodist Church, division and union sat very much alongside each other. They're a good case study of how the tension of intra-denominational divisions sat alongside efforts for interdenominational union. Lots has been written on why the ecumenical movement gained momentum in the 20th century. So the chapter begins by suggesting a few factors that shaped the VMA and their stance against union. Won't go to these in detail, but theological factors are ever important, and the VMA's view that the Church of England was on a trajectory towards Roman Catholicism, and also ecumenical experiences within Methodism also colouring their view. They formed in November 1963, and the Joint Committee produced their report in February that year. And a number of Methodists expressed concern about the lack of scrutiny given to the report, as well as some who suspected foul play by the pro-union group TAMU. The Reverend A.E. Clucas Moore gathered the names of those who expressed concern in the Methodist Recorder. He invited them to meet together, and the VMA was formed with the Reverend Dr. Leslie Newman as chairman and Clucas Moore himself as vice chairman. They were a controversial group for a number of reasons. Firstly, the name Voice of Methodism suggested that theirs was the only voice which truly represented Methodism. And it could be perceived, and was perceived, as dismissive of other views held within the church. Secondly, their language could be controversial. They produced a stream of leaflets and a bulletin, and the language could be quite provocative. And probably the most controversial action they were associated with was the originating summons issued against the President and Secretary of the Methodist Conference by two VMA members, Bernard Barker, the General Secretary, and Henry Wanstall, the VMA's solicitor. The case was heard in June 1970, and the court papers and affidavits give us a really great source for insight into where those dividing lines lay between the VMA and conference. I've suggested three lines of division, one of which is differences in interpretation of the constitutional documents of the Methodist Church, particularly the 1932 Deed of Union. And this was a really important document to Barker and Wanstall's case. They argued that the scheme was ultra vires on the, quote, true construction of the 1932 deed. So the interpretation was really important. And of course, the deed itself was the product of long ecumenical negotiations between the Wesleyans, Primitive Methodists and United Methodists in the 1920s. So it's interesting to see how it went from a document that united Methodists to a basis of division in a few decades. A second area of division was doctrine, particularly church governance. And the VMA were concerned that union would curb the role of the laity and lead to certain roles and statuses being the exclusive domain of ministers rather than open to the laity. And the third area suggested is around polity. They called for a referendum of the whole Methodist Church because they claimed they were being denied, quote, an inherent fundamental right to determine their own destiny. So they had concerns that the sort of grassroots of Methodism wasn't being consulted. They lost the court action largely because the 1932 Deed of Union itself stated that conference was the final authority in the interpretation of doctrine. And so in passing the 1969 resolution, conference had implicitly declared it compatible with Methodist doctrine. And in this sense, the VMA's tactics undermined their cause. A civil court was never going to overrule conference on a doctrinal matter. So they were somewhat limited in terms of the extent to which they achieved their aims. And by 1972, they were an ageing group and had always mainly been seen as a fringe group. And I conclude by suggesting that their limited impact signifies a wider shift in notions of spirituality, when the goal of ecumenical unity was coming to be seen as more spiritually virtuous than just denominational survival. Some Methodists compared it to the concept of death giving way to life, a case of denominational death giving way to the life of ecumenical unity. And as such, the VMA's self-declared aim of uncompromising opposition was just counter to these trends. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Claire. And I'm delighted that you're one of the people who've drilled into the VMA archive. And I guess you probably still have the tongs and the asbestos gloves to cope with some of that inflammatory language. But thank you very much. Next, another change of pace, really, and moving to Phillip Tovey, who I see is sitting above the white horse. Welcome, Phillip. And Phillip is going to introduce his essay, which is on the 1968 Ordinal and the Service of Reconciliation.
So I've had a long-standing interest in liturgy, and when I was ordained deacon in 1987 and then priest in 1988, the service used was actually a variation on the Anglican-Methodist Ordinal. And I think that we don't quite recognise at times, if some of those of you who've been ordained in the Methodist Church will also have used services that are based very strongly on the Anglican-Methodist Ordinal. And you can trace, certainly I'm not so good on Methodist liturgy as I am on Anglican liturgy, you could trace an influence of this ordinal around the world. And in fact, it's because it comes from the Church of South India ordinal, which was the influence on the Anglican Methodist one, if you see what I mean. So that ordinal has become the sort of paradigm of liturgical revision in the Anglican Communion. And therefore we can trace, particularly through the Church of England, into other provinces, an influence of it. So I think one thing I was really interested in looking at was the influences that were made around the world from this, and how this was really important in this service of ordination, which is sort of central to all our churches in some ways, in providing ministry. And I think we mustn't underestimate the influence of the Anglican Methodist Ordinal at this point as a part of that process. With regard to the Service of Reconciliation, which was the other one which Pippa mentioned earlier in it, personally, I sort of approached it as a rather doomed activity, because it was trying to achieve cover to greater ground. There were those who didn't want to see it as a reordination and those who did. And that's fundamentally a stretch that you can't cover. I think part of the problem is, and we've talked a bit about the Church of South India, the Church of South India accepted an interim period when ministers or priests wouldn't have been episcopally ordained. I mean, the situation now is they all are, and everybody's episcopally ordained in the church. But as Mark said, there was a very strong reaction from Anglo-Catholics with notices up saying, you know, we are not in communion with the Church of South India, stuck on church doors and things like that. I think the part of, because of that reaction, the result too with when the Church of North India came, they made an effort at sort of topping everybody up type idea so that we all get to the same level. And I think there's elements of that in this reconciliation service. And I think that that's problematic in and of itself too. And it's not a very simple, straightforward solution to it. So I think there's just too many unsolved issues there. And I think one of the issues is are we willing, as Anglicans I'm speaking of, to accept some sort of interim period? And it would appear, I mean, there have been further discussions of Anglican-Methodist unity, and it would appear that the answer with some of them very strongly still is no. And I find it really quite sad in recent discussions that I've seen in articles in the Church Times over the last years, that we are simply not moving on in any way at all. If I might, you know, like a mighty tortoise moves the Church of God, brothers, we are treading where we've always trod. And it does feel a bit like that there isn't much step forward in some of the discussions. So I find the thing today quite saddening. However, I am encouraged by the book, because I think if we, I looked through the book, I wasn't quite sure what it was going to be like when you know, when you first get it, when you've got all these different things. But I was more encouraged as I looked through it, and I thought, this is actually bringing back these issues in a way that are relevant to today, so that people can see that these issues are ones that we still need to deal with and talk about, and not simply repeat what our particular party or group has repeated. So I think the book is quite useful and timely in that way, and contributing, I think I'm agreeing with Mark actually, to the wider discussion about these things. And if we can see some of the failings of the past, we might be able to see some of the steps we might take in the future, or things we might avoid taking in the future. And as that, I'm very hopeful as a result of this book that we might actually give us a bit of a steer in the right sort of direction at some point.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Philip. The idea that the book itself is a contributor to the sort of conversations in the future is a great one, and perhaps an unintended outcome of finally, in terms of the contributors, we have Jane Platt, one of the editors, who's going to talk about her essay, which was focused on grassroots and the voice of the grassroots in Methodism. So Jane, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Bill. When you asked me to list the Dammit papers, to say that I was excited would have been an understatement, particularly when just one glance at Pippa's overflowing document boxes showed me how much correspondence I'd encounter. Equally importantly, I'd wanted to meet Martin since I'd first read his work on evangelicalism. So this co-edited volume represents for me a dream come true. So thank you all. However, not long after starting to read the documents, my mind's eye began to wander. It began to see an image of a barred door against which a band of ordained persons and their supporters were vigorously hurling themselves, while on the other side of the door, various other groups were either staring in bewilderment or protesting loudly. And all to no avail. No one could hear anything over the din. And anyway, the door just wouldn't open. Accordingly, one of my main memories from researching the correspondence is that the vocabulary of engagement adopted by many of the actors on both sides was violent and extreme. So what caused this war of words to happen? Despite Methodist leaders' claims that their denomination is primarily a grassroots movement, both it and the Church of England are hidebound by rules delivered through layers from above. So when leading churchmen of both denominations decided on ecumenical reform, they anticipated that most worshippers would accept their decision, particularly since those leaders deemed this decision to be the will of God. But top-down insistence on fundamental change rarely seems to work well with the people at the bottom, the grassroots. And using that particular phrase, the will of God, when addressing people of faith, will either cow them into submission or act like a red rag to a bull. And so was ushered in a period when many churchgoers felt that they were fighting an enemy within, as well as an enemy without, all apparently in the name of God. As the conversations progressed, eventual full union became the leaders' dominant aim. Yet letters sent from all over England to the leaders of this dissentient groups echoed views encapsulated in the title of Professor T.E. Jessop's contemporaneous booklet, Not This Way. Jessop counselled that visible unity between Christian churches was desirable, but didn't have to be institutional. And this view was echoed in Methodist circuit quarterly meetings. In 1968, almost half the voters said that they didn't wish to proceed with the union scheme. Theirs was not an anti-Anglican vote. What they were saying was, not this way. Or to put it rather differently, wait, these conversations are leading to too much, too soon. Well, after the double failure of the union vote in the Anglican Synod, the Guardian offered an explanation. The church is a secular as well as a sacred institution. The divisions within it reflect at a secular level the cultural preferences of worshippers as well as what churchmen would see as different paths towards the same divine summit. Leaders of the two churches eventually took heed of this advice by setting out a gentler way to gain their desired end through local ecumenical partnerships and other experiments. For the Guardian's words had been perceptive. Churchgoers have cultural preferences intertwined with their religious beliefs, and this leads them to a view which they regard as totally legitimate. It's worth remembering then, in layman's language, that in the middle of the 20th century, many Methodists had an almost congregational preference for local traditions and individual freedoms, compared to Anglicans' love of established liturgy and ceremonial. To Anglicans, Holy Communion was their focal point, whereas, as we know, many Methodists preferred hymn singing, the sermon, free prayer by the minister, salvation through grace. Anglicans thought their church the true Catholic Church of England, tracing its history through ordination back to apostolic times, while many Methodists believed in justification by faith, individual dedication, Christian service. When consulted on the views of the role of their minister, Anglicans likened the status to that bestowed by the apostolic succession and the laying on of hands by a bishop. But many Methodists thought that their minister was a servant of the churches who, largely from administrative convenience, accepted special duties. There was also very real divisions between the leaders at the centre and churchgoers who saw themselves as being at the periphery, particularly churchgoers from the country's edges, such as Cornwall and Cumbria. The affection that Methodist groups at the peripheries felt for older evangelical Bible Christian or primitive Methodist traditions led some to secede from the Methodist connection altogether. Adding to such very real religious and cultural dissimilarities, some Methodists believed that Anglicans displayed a high-handedness towards them. They believed that Anglicans thought of them as people who were somehow less worthy, both in their worship and in their social class. As a colleague reminded me only recently, many churchgoers at the time regarded Wesleyans as merely working-class Anglicans. Yet as the nature of society has changed over time, and as Anglican attendance has dwindled and Methodism has lost members, the logistical necessity of linking parishes together and decommissioning churches suggests an even more pressing need for change. In this religious drought, those grassroots that remain urgently require an invigorating shower of heavenly rain. That's me done, thanks.
Thank you very much, Jane. Now that's, I think, a kind of a nice flavour of some of, but not all of the articles in the collection. So I hope those brief introductions have whetted some of your appetites to go out and buy a copy of it or obtain a review copy of it. Now we're very fortunate in having Andrew Chandler from the University of Chichester with us, who isn't a contributor to the collection, but who's agreed to read it and give us his sort of oral review of the collection. So Andrew, thank you very much for coming along, and we look forward to hearing what you say about it.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Bill, and thank you to you all for this invitation. It's very gracious, not to say optimistic of you, to think that you're fortunate to have me, and I shall hope to justify that in about maybe at the very outside 15 minutes of reflections. on the book that I've read. I have to confess that I've read it on my screen. Mine hasn't arrived yet either, but it's been a great pleasure to keep company with you all virtually, both in that form and in the form to which we've now succumbed. So thank you very much. I have to say that when I'm asked to review books, and I'm not going to offer a review, I didn't think that would be, well, I think that would be really rather irritating over the next 15 minutes. I often wonder what a collection of essays is going to turn out like. I think all of us probably have, to some extent, a lingering perception that they're always proverbial curate's eggs, and especially denominational histories run into difficulties because they're so busy often paying their dues to the people who are currently in charge of the denominations in question. And that generally produces a still greater unevenness in the quality of contributions, I have to admit. So the first thing I felt with this book was this is actually marvellously free of that. You've tucked away that at the very beginning, kept it firmly in its place, and then historical scholarship of a creative and fruitful kind is free to take over. And I do want to say that I've enjoyed the book enormously. I've learned a lot from it. It's given me a strong sense of picture which no other study has really generated for me. And therefore, it's a book that deserves to be there. It isn't just a paying of dues, it's something that is creating new perspectives and breaking new ground and showing a range of scholarship and experience, which I think I do know how to value and which I do value very much indeed. I think whether it's the long views offered by Martin and Pippa, or whether it's a question of looking very close up at the participants, as John Lenton does, or the figures of Ramsey and Eric Maskell, as Peter Webster does, or the groups and the associations, the lobbies even, that are participating in the melee, as I find in the articles by Andrew and Claire and Martin too. There's a sense equally that the craft of the historian is available in the open perspectives, which are always there. Everything here seems to be rooted in a sense of social and even political context, and therefore is always arguing for a particular significance in those terms, rather than seeking a foundation in the mysteries or justifications of denominational existence. I therefore found Jane's article on grassroots particularly fascinating, and I'll come back to that a bit in a moment. Peter Howson's article on chaplains opened up perspectives for me too, not least that brief but suggestive reference to chaplaincies in the National Health Service. That would have been a very interesting line to follow. And then, of course, in terms of liturgy, the emphasis that comes with Phillip's article on the ordinal and David's survey of post-1972 developments, all of this in a sense produces a very coherent scheme, and that's immensely reassuring. So I'm really, as a reader, very grateful for all of that, and I'm very grateful for the extent to which it's helped me to rethink something that actually one can all too easily be rather lazy about. I mentioned this enterprise to my father earlier today. I'm a retired Baptist minister, now in his early 90s, and Dad responded, well, the great failure. And I think that's probably where a lot of people have come to rest on this. But it isn't actually a point of rest, as this book shows. I think one of the things that struck me, perhaps most of all about it, in a most satisfactory way, is the nature of the book and the variety of approaches and perspectives employed within it do something to free us from that old narrative model, which has been very effectively put forward by a number of writers and very credibly done as well. There is a sense within the conventional narrative of just who the participants are, why they manage to do some things and don't manage to do others, and where the possibility of success somehow evaporates into an almost tawdry and dismal, rather self-interested dissolution of failure. And the success and failure model is, of course, one that is very hard to resist in most narrative histories, but I think it's been rather heavily challenged, actually, by many of the articles here. It led me to think very much more in terms of what kind of ground was gained, and whether that ground was interesting, and whether the nature of the exercise had exposed significant and interesting things about the churches themselves. And from a historian's point of view, I think that's actually really rather more interesting than a sense of a political success which maybe achieves some new form, satisfactory to some and not so satisfactory to others. In the writing of church history, it is very important to show the different levels and dimensions that are at work, rather than being drawn into the obvious narratives and a treatment of the obvious constituents. And in that sense, you've all produced a pluralistic and diverse picture, which is fascinating and which is suggestive and revealing in all kinds of important ways. And in an area where church history is not particularly well served. And that chronological weakness is something that should be acknowledged too. It is in that sense a valuable piece of work. The other thing that I suppose we tend to assume is at the heart of all of this is the great debate about episcopacy and the way that rolls into ordination. And there is much value, not least in Pippa's article, in terms of recognizing, as actually Archbishop Fisher recognized, that episcopacy has different models, often within the same traditions and different periods of time. And therefore, there is necessarily some fixed model there that's being superimposed over a set of discussions, because even that is moving too. And Mark has demonstrated that also in his fine article for the volume. Of course, it does emphasize, though, that something is moving into the center of the picture and it won't always shift. And that is the question not just of episcopacy, but of ordained ministry. And the centrality of that is something that I might just refer to briefly a little bit later on. So I've enjoyed the diversity, the sense of different trajectories, the opportunity to learn about a variety of participants. And I think all of this opens one's eyes to a much more complex and much more rewarding picture of the Anglican-Methodist encounter in that particular time. I must admit that my own sympathies and background probably play a role, of course, in the way that I've read this. And many of you would be quite right to wonder in what way I'm qualified to think about all of this, and perhaps even in a sort of way review it. My background has had two particular elements, I think, which are pertinent. Firstly, the work to which I've committed most of my life really on George Bell, with particular reference also to Geoffrey Fisher, who I find to be often a very misunderstood and underestimated figure, actually. And when I was looking at Fisher in particular, I found myself recognizing what a formidable and clear and cogent thinker he really was, and how much that was taken for granted and even eclipsed by these rather lazy views that he was a headmaster who ended up by one route in Lambeth Palace. Now, to Bell, I'll come a little bit later, but of course it is important, as Pippa has emphasised, that Bell is part of this picture, and his participation, as usual with Bell, raises questions, almost of a what-if character, and they won't go away, and there's no particular reason why they should, but it's appropriate that historians should explore them. Now, many subjects, I suppose, particularly at the moment, are rightly exposed to different approaches which emphasize class, as Jane has done most fruitfully, and gender, which is present in the book, even though, of course, it can't be fashioned into a leading principle. It is important in the terms that you've exposed it. I think the intergenerational relationships, and Claire's reference to an aging organization, this is something that won't go away either. There is the reality of chronology. There's the reality of intergenerational perceptions. I have to admit at this point to a bit of a prejudice. and that is that I think that those who were very much in charge in the 60s and the 70s were, to my mind, far less interesting and creative than those who were very much in charge in the 1920s and 1930s. I can't quite tell you why I feel that, but there's something perhaps in the quality of the English, there's something in the vitality of the thought and the sheer commitment. If one thinks about the 1920 Lambeth appeal to all Christian people, there is a sense of excitement about all of this. It's not at all a tour of duty by plodding ecclesiastical or ecumenical diplomats. And I think that this is something that seems to me to go for that whole period. It's not the period of greatest riches, as far as I'm concerned. I might have to run the risk of irritating Mark by saying that last week I was in Lambeth Palace Library looking at Lambeth conference reports, and I have to say that the proceedings for 1920 and 1930 were so much more interesting than the ones for the later part of the 20th century. I won't develop that point now. I just leave it provocatively for you to resent or smile upon, hopefully smile upon indulgently. Now, I had for, I suppose, much of my career, such as it has been a career, a very close relationship with Reg Ward, whose work will be known, I think, to all of you. And when I pick up a book on Methodism, I always think, well, how would Reg have been looking at this? And because I knew him well, and because he enjoyed being cantankerous about all kinds of things that occur in this particular book, it's not actually too difficult to see not only how Reg would read the book, but how he was, in a sense, a background participant alongside Kingsley Barrett in the controversies as they occurred. Reg, who died about 7 or 8 years ago now, was never offended to be called the last surviving primitive Methodist. And of course, he exposed in all kinds of ways how complex Methodism once had been and how complex it actually remained, one might say tribally, after 1932. But the thing that Reg emphasized most in one of his most provocative articles, and in some ways most difficult articles, was the relationship between clericalism and decline. And I think this does affect the issues that are explored in your book at the moment. Because as far as Reg was concerned, clericalism, clericalization of the church, interacted with decline and actually facilitated it. And therefore, a church that pursued a clericalizing agenda was, in a sense, writing its own decline in terms of congregational vitality and all the rest of it. Now, I think that this wasn't a bit of truculent, though flawlessly courteous, anti-clericalism. This is a very serious point, and I'd like to come back to that later on. But I think that the place of the laity in all of this is represented in the book in new ways, which add something to that particular perspective, that this isn't simply a negotiation between clerical oligarchs, but is something that is forming within a wider picture of understandings. And I think that the way in which those understandings begin to emerge, not least in terms of class and region, and in terms of primitive Methodism and Wesleyan Methodism, and conservative evangelical Anglicanism and Anglo-Catholicism, all of that I think is fascinatingly established by your book. I'm surprised in some ways that Methodist Conference, Church Assembly, and then of course General Synod didn't feature more prominently, and wondered if that was possibly one area which saw the eclipse of Rupert Davis as a figure, someone who I think had a very clear sense of his own authority in those contexts and supported the agenda that was being promoted. But that's obviously something that one might think about in another way. Now, I mentioned a number of things that have informed my own approach to this, but perhaps the one that becomes most relevant is a little book that I did a few years ago on Handsworth College in Birmingham and the Queen's College in Birmingham too. These, as noted by Pippa, are amalgamated in 1970, and I worked there for quite a number of years and observed it at quite close quarters, though I think at a safe distance. And in many ways, one of the things that seemed quite clear to me was the view at that time that the Queen's College, or the foundation as it subsequently became, was the beached whale of the Anglican-Methodist negotiations of that time. It was the advance party that found itself running up the beach and looking behind to find that the entire invasion fleet had somehow disappeared behind it. And that sense of being slightly stranded within an ongoing and resiliently denominational narrative was certainly very present. But Queen's did achieve some very significant things, and in a very difficult context, which was not perhaps the context that might have been predicted for it. And I want to just quote one thing from Gordon Wakefield, who's a figure who continues to surface in these contexts, from an annual report of Queen's in the 1980s. And this, in a sense, does have some resonance for us. He writes, "What is the future of ecumenism, against which the tide of the 1980s seems to be flowing? Are we fitting men and women for ministry in the real world? Does our corporate life reflect any genuine Christian skill in living together? Or do we simply exist in respectable tolerance with intermittent outbreaks of caring, or alternatively myopia?" There were no illusions at Queen's in the 1980s that this was a very difficult agenda to pursue. And I think there is a strong sense as the 1980s move into the 1990s that it isn't simply a question of the resilience of denomination, but the growing encroachments of secularization. These things together begin to alter perspectives. But I do want to say very briefly that the place of intellectual thought in the two churches is something that might be worth maintaining, whether people were thinking together theologically, publishing together. Still, there is a sense in the 80s and 90s that this answers to an essentially denominational approach. And I found in my work that across the 20th century, there are very few partnerships between scholars across the denominations that really achieve something by way of a new understanding, a new meeting place between them. Now, I must conclude, but I do want to return to the question of denominationalism. Someone like the Baptist J.H. Shakespeare had a view that denominationalism was a prerequisite to church unity. And I think that this was obviously a hopeful view, but there are questions as to why Christians got stuck with denominations, even as denominations declined. I think that in many ways, it would be wrong to think that denominations are static. They clearly change a great deal over time. And I think both Methodists and Anglicans are now seeing what it is to live in an increasingly managerial denomination. Anglicans are certainly seeing bishops as managers. I don't say this as slack rhetoric. I think this is actually happening in ways that would not have occurred to Anglicans 30, 40 years ago. And therefore, the meeting place between Anglicans and Methodists is shifting within the denominational realities that continue to occur before us. I think that it's also possible, drawing on your book, that the whole idea of the denomination is perhaps no longer, and hasn't been for a long time, the great tribal reality which British Christianity at large has presented. It's long seemed that the division between a broadly conservative evangelical tribe and a liberal mainstream has defined just about every denomination that is to be found. And I think in that sense, the book shows that there is something of a non-denominational dialogue going on, which continues to define a great deal around us. So where does this all of this lead? It's natural to ask the question, and I suppose I, least of all, have any sense of what the answer to that may be. But there are no questions about secularization as a reality. And I think that in this sense, I want to finish with a reference to George Bell. As far as George Bell was concerned, as early as 1951, the failure of ecumenical enterprise to achieve the kind of results that a generation ago would have been predicted was essentially rooted in one thing which begins to emerge with some clarity in your book. And that is the context, that is the landscape. Bell asked the question, why was union possible in India and not in Britain? And he answers this by saying, basically, it's because they cared enough about the place of Christianity within the society in which they'd come to live. They cared about its witness, they cared about its mission, and they could recognize that denominationalism, in a sense, trivialized Christian faith and made it marginal where it could perhaps be more influential. It was, in short, a luxury which Christians could not afford. And Bell was entirely clear about that. And therefore, the question that might occur about the Methodist-Anglican conversations, however one views them, is really a contextual question. Whether they were looking to arrange their denominational connections and ideas in a way that, in a sense, served their own satisfaction, or whether they were conscious of a set of perspectives which were more broadly, sociologically, societally framed, and which in turn would provide a sense of urgency and clarity. Denominationalism, of course, does produce a sense that you just have to satisfy the requirements of the people who are in charge of the denominations and hope that everybody else doesn't grumble too much in the meantime. But as William Temple and George Bell knew, that is not really the fundamental question on which the Christian church actually rests. That, in a sense, is a crucial insight which remains with us, however we view the future that lies before both churches. So I do thank you very much for the kind invitation to talk. I hope I haven't outstayed my welcome, but I do want to say that this is a book that I do look forward to receiving, and which I shall actually enjoy owning, and I hope will enjoy a wide and appreciative audience. And let us hope for influence, though I think it's important perhaps to acknowledge that neither of our churches, or none of our churches these days, are in the hands of historians. They're in the hands of people who are, in a sense, managing the present rather than looking for models which may be incorporated from the past. Well, let's do the best we can to persuade them.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Some thought-provoking comments, and I particularly like the idea that Anglican-Methodist Union had the opportunity to bring thinkers together, because I think that's one of the elements in this book, is the unity of thinking between people of different perspectives. We finished today with an editor's perspective, so over to Martin.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, colleagues, for sharing snapshots of the chapters that you've contributed to the book, and enormous thanks to Andrew for that really insightful presentation, raising a lot more questions which we might wish to explore and can fruitfully do, and we will make sure that you do receive a copy of the book too. Briefly, the editor's perspective. Well, I've been involved over the years with, I think, 4 multi-author books as editor, 1 as a sole editor, and 3 times working with colleagues, and it's always been good to share with other people. And the experience this time of working with Jane has been a real joy in producing the book we're considering this afternoon. 2 of the other collaborations I was involved in began with an idea and then led to identifying topics and contributors. So it began with a blank sheet of paper. 1 began with a conference and therefore a given set of material, and that was the case with this book as well. The genesis was a day conference hosted by Bill at Oxford Brookes in November 2018, drawing on material that Pippa had accumulated and then given to the Oxford Centre. So Bill then suggested at the end of the day conference that it would be good to use the papers presented as the nucleus of a volume. Beginning in that way brought a number of advantages, and it also brought a number of challenges. The advantages were that topics were already mapped out through the conference, contributors already identified, and quite a momentum already in place, and therefore also quite a bit of material in hand. The challenges were, first, that the material wasn't necessarily in our hands as editors. was in the hands of those who'd spoken at the day conference and needed to be converted from oral presentation into essays for a book. There were inevitably some gaps in the coverage in the conference. The programme wasn't necessarily fully comprehensive or necessarily balanced, and we had to think about other material to include. And then we had the problem of finding a publisher. Very different from going with a proposal, getting the proposal approved and then seeking contributions. We had the material, needed to find somebody to publish it. How did we then meet the challenges? Well, with great tribute to the contributors who did a sterling job writing up their conference papers and responding to editorial queries and to a certain amount of editorial stress. So thank you everyone for your patience in working with us to bring the material together. And thanks too to those who responded to requests for new material to add breadth to the coverage, to Mark Chapman, Andrew Atherstone, and David Chapman and Peter Webster, who were the invited extra people who hadn't been at the day conference, but who responded so graciously to our request. There were some who couldn't take part, and there are some areas that we would like to have covered that didn't. One I was thinking about was a comparison with relationships between Anglicans and Methodists in North America, which would have been a really interesting thing to consider, but there just wasn't opportunity to do that. Finding the publisher, that was a real saga. We had the option of self-publishing and decided not to take that route. We then looked to a number of established publishers, and really grateful to Routledge and to the editorial group of the Methodist Studies series for accepting our proposal. And the Routledge team did a fantastic job in turning our manuscript into the book that we see before us now. I quoted in one of my sections in the book Norman Snaith's description of the Voice of Methodism Association General Committee, when he says it was like a prize fight with all the spectators actually in the ring. I'm really glad that the process of producing this volume wasn't anything like that. And so I want to round off by saying renewed thanks to everyone who played a part in bringing us to this point and in securing the book that we now have before us. And we hope that it will be a stimulating and useful resource for the Academy and for the Church for a long time to come. Thank you.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. Yes, prize fighters not in the ring, I think is probably pretty good for a collection of essays. Well, our hour is up.